Hello again, friends. This is going to be Tier 3 and Tier 3.5 for my vintage tier list. This is going to cover a lot of decks that a lot of people aren't running, things that aren't commonly considered, but I did try to include just about everything, and I tried to put them in relative power brackets. So, Tier 3, I think, are going to be decks that are, generally speaking, going to lose to the big four if they go first, on average, but they still can win. It's just more likely that they're going to lose. And these are either high variance decks or decks that have some type of major drawback or are lacking some core facet to make the deck work. And I think that the first example is a premium one. CEO Amaterasu with Riley as the backup rearguard. So, in theory, nothing about this should fail to work. CEO Soul Charges, which lets you get Oracle Think Tank cards in your Soul. Once you have 6, you can use your Riley to try and finish the game. CEO gives you an increased chance of hitting critical triggers, similar to hitting the sack, only you don't have to wait as long to do it, and she hits harder. So with a 7k boost, Amaterasu is 21k, which is going to make it even harder for your opponents to guard. So everything in theory with that should work, and it should have a fairly comparable grade 1 and grade 2 lineup. So what's the problem? The problem is that there does not exist a starter for Oracle Think Tank, and that really dampens how things are going to go with this deck. So right now, your two choices are Lozenge Magus, which will remove one from your soul, which will make it harder to hit your Riley. Or you could run the Tsukuyomi Ride Chain, and at that point, what the heck are you doing? Why are you not just running Tsukuyomi? So because that's the case, it makes it so that this deck kind of has an internal conflict between how you would like it to work and how it's going to function, even if the end game itself does make some degree of sense. And because of that, it makes you feel like you're better off just running the Tsukuyomi version, and to be completely honest with you, you are. So that's kind of why this deck is down in Tier 3. Nothing about it is awful, other than the fact that it just doesn't have that internal synergy to make itself work. And plus, if you fail to hit the ride chain, you're going to be sitting there fairly crippled, and it's going to make it so that you don't have enough soul when you actually get to CEO, and then you may not even reach the point where you can use your Riley, which is a much bigger risk in this particular deck than you would have with the Tsukuyomi deck. So next up we have Invincible Overlord. Invincible Overlord has been the bread and butter staple of mixed decks for ages. This was one of the very first decks that everyone thought of. It's very solid. Having a 16k Dragonic Overlord and then standing it with a stand trigger makes it 21k. Everything about it is nice. It's beautiful. It works. But its biggest weakness is that you have to get Invincible and you have to get Overlord. If you miss one, then your deck just isn't going to do anything. And if your deck's not doing anything, then you're not going to be winning too many matches. And also, you can't cheese wins with critical triggers because you're going to be running stands. So you're a little bit forced into having to get both of those grade 3s. And you can't just get 2 of one. You have to get 1 of each. And even then, if they're able to take out your Dragonic Overlord through any means, then you're also just kind of up a creek without a paddle at that point. So the deck obviously has those consistency weaknesses, but when it works very well. The next deck I have is Pacifica. Pacifica is a little bit weaker than the other Bermuda bosses that I've listed so far. She's not terrible by any stretch of the imagination. Her effect actually allows her to both be a 13k attacker, which is very good, and she gets to Soul Charge and then put a card, or she draws a card, puts a card from hand on bottom of deck. This filtration is very, very nice, and because Bermuda has access to so many cards that can benefit from the on-hit bounce effects of the Perla Sisters, then you have the ability to get extra advantage through the filtration that you might not have otherwise been able to get. So it's a very, very good consistency metric to have. And it's just an overall pretty solid boss. I don't think you're going to be using the Mega Blast, but it's just a decent card all around. Next up, these two decks are going to be basically the same deck. Shubelia with Mr. Invincible. Shubelia is Soul Blast 3 when it hits, then you get to Soul Blast the 3, of course, and draw a card. So this card is very useful in an Invincible build because it lets you use that excess soul. And this deck is also going to be using things like Kirara and Jack in order to use those counterblasts, and then Mr. Invincible will unflip those. So you have multiple on-hit draw a card, and you have unflip engine, you have an 11k rear guard to attack with. All in all, the deck ends up being very solid from having good rows, good pressure, and lots of advantage. And then it's able to just continuously pump out its own resources. So that deck is actually pretty solid. And we have the Mega Colony version of that, which is Death Warden Antlion with Master Fraud. Master Fraud is the same thing. So because you get the soul every single turn, then your soul ends up getting pretty large. You can use Master Fraud to soul blast that out, draw a card. You have Water Gang, which is the same thing as Kirara. And you don't have the unflipping engine, so it might be a little bit weaker in that regard, but you do have access to other things that can stun, such as Mega Colony Battler B, and it ends up being a fairly viable strategy. This is not as strong as it would be once we have Cavalry of Black Steel. We had Cavalry of Black Steel before we got set 4 in English, so that was already something we could use because there was Machining Mosquito, which was Soul Charge 1 on call. That ended up helping out the deck pretty nicely. They also had access to an actual starter, which was Mega Colony Battler C, I believe, which was Counterblast 1, stun a grade 1 or less, move it to Soul on hit, or on the hit that it boosts. So we don't have some of the cards that would have made that better. Machining Armor Beetle was also another good card for this particular deck. So it's much weaker than it would have otherwise been. But once those cards come out, then the deck will get stronger, but also we'll have way more other cards. So I don't know where it will stack up then. So right now it's just solid tier 3. Next up is Galahad with extra grade 3s. So Galahad Rush, I think, is a little bit stronger than regular Galahad, while you can be running cards like Palamedes, and Palamedes in conjunction with Borgles allow you to hit 22k rows, and you can even run Marins and have 21k rows. That works, and that's fine, but the problem that you're going to end up having is that you're just not going to be dealing the damage enough, and you're not really having anything to use those counterblasts on. You could run perhaps Akane into Pongal, and then use the soul that you build up by riding into Galahad for a Soul Saver Dragon. This was actually something that was discussed in my Discord server yesterday or the day before yesterday, and that strategy actually seems like it might have some potential. But the problem is that the thing that's helping you make a bunch of your good rows is Borgle, and that would turn off Borgle, so you'd be getting 15k power this turn, but you'd be losing 3k from all of your Borgles, and that might not be the best. The deck has a little bit of this internal fighting with itself, but it's not terrible. It's tier 3. Next up, we have Superior Ride Kagero. So there are 2 Superior Rides pretty early on for Kagero. One of them is the Aleph Chain, which uses Tar and Bar, and the other one is the Blazing Flare Dragon Chain, which uses Blazing Core, Iron Tail, and Gatling Claw Dragon. And you can run all of these in the same deck. Conroe can fish out the grade 1 if you need it to, and this allows you to have the opportunity to Superior Ride. If you Superior Ride Blazing Core, you have the 5 soul for Blazing Flare. If you Superior Ride into Aleph, then you have all of the cards in soul that you need to unflip everything, and you can run other cards that expend counterblast, such as Berserk Dragons, Kimnaras. Well, there might not necessarily be room for too much extra in the grade 1 and grade 2 lineups, because you're running all of the Superior Ride pieces, but there are things that you can utilize. Typically speaking, though, you're going to be using the counterblast on Aleph himself, and if you have Aleph as the Vanguard, then you can Soul Blast all of those cards out and then use his effect again, so you can have 3 crit, or if you have an Aleph rearguard, 2 crit, 2 crit. And then Blazing Flare, if you get that, then you're just going to use its effect to blow something up, and then it'll get power, and your other Blazing Flare will get power. So all in all, the deck works just by going right to grade 3 and then running 12 crits. So that way, because you have such a high chance of Superior Ride, you're putting your pressure on your opponents earlier, and you're able to get the damage in pretty quickly. And that's how that deck works. It's obviously not supremely great because it doesn't have any like supremely good advantage engine, but just being able to go fast, go hard, and then bonk face is still respectable. Next up, we have Enigman Rain. Enigman Rain is probably the best boss Dimension Police has right now, because it only requires you to get 2,000 extra power in order for its effect to activate. The 4,000 power requirement is honestly very, very difficult for modern Dimension Police, or not modern, for ancient Dimension Police to manage, because they don't have any cards that do that very well outside of Cosmobeak. We actually did have another card that we already had at this point that was a grade 3 that counterblasted to, I think it was Cosmo Greater, and it allowed you to have extra cards that would be able to help you unlock your effect. But right now, because it's so difficult, and because so many of the cards don't give 4,000, they give less, Cosmo Roar and Mass Police Grandeur, that makes Enigman Rain a lot easier to have be the active card. And Enigma and Rain also has great synergy with Miracle Beauty. I don't think I pulled Miracle Beauty up. I did not. Miracle Beauty is obviously when you stand Miracle Beauty, you stand her booster. And that makes it so that Enigma and Rain, if it hits, gets the full shebang as far as your Laurel plays are concerned. So you can actually swing Miracle Beauty with a boost, both of them boosted. And then if you hit a stand trigger, and then if Enigma and Rain hits, you stand the other Miracle Beauty, and then you can rest all of those again, and then stand it with Laurel. And then you can just kind of keep going with that. You just need to hit a stand trigger every drive check and hit the Vanguard. Not supremely reliable, but I mean, it is a cheese strat, I guess. Overall, it works better just because it's easier to have the effect be live, and the effect itself is really strong in conjunction with Miracle Beauty. The next deck would be Enigma and Storm. Enigma and Storm and Dayusha are I have them both in the same section of the tier list. I don't think you're running both because Miracle Beauty is just too good and you have 6 stands. However, Dayusha and Storm do the exact same thing, and the builds are almost identical, other than the potential 12k attacker that Storm has. And you don't want to run that 12k attacker because you need Grander, Cosmo Beak, and the grade 2 for the ride chain. So you're entirely stuck with your lineup anyway. So the only difference between Storm and Dayusha is Storm allows you to use your grade 1 ride chain to get rid of excess copies so that you can get more in hand. And Dayusha is just if you miss the grade 2, then you don't get punished for it. Those are the only real differences between the decks because we don't have any other starters yet for Dimension Police other than based Worker Pod Saturday. And because of that, there's nothing really that the deck can do that's any different. So Storm and Dayusha are just the same deck in this format. Neither of them are particularly strong because all your opponent has to do is just guard your center row, and then you're really not doing a whole lot. So it is what it is. The bonus crit's nice, but it's not easy to make it active with only Cosmo Beak as the only card that gets you all the way there. Sure, you have Guide Dolphins, the stand trigger, which can move to Soul and give plus 3k. Then you can attack with a Mass Police Grander. And then you have either a 15k Dayusha or a 16k Storm. The problem is that, once again, all your opponent has to do is stop your middle row, and your deck doesn't do anything. So that's kind of where that deck's at. Next up, we have Spike Brothers. Spike Brothers currently only has one boss card, and that's Safe Read. I'm not going to count the Mega Blaster. So Safe Read is when it drive checks a grade 3, you can call it to an open rearguard circle. That's not supremely great. You basically need to have already played either Skydiver and have it hit. That is very important. Skydiver has to hit, and then the cards you call has to also be able to leave the field in order for this effect to proc, or you have to be using Juggernaut Maximum and have an appropriate amount of soul. Having the soul is difficult. While we do have, is it Dudley Dan? I don't remember. The grade 1 4K, Counterblast 2, put a card from hand into soul, search your deck for a card, superior call it. That can get out a Juggernaut Maximum, and that's great, and that also fulfills the soul requirement for Juggernaut Maximum. But the problem is that also means that if you drive check 2 grade 3s, you can't call both. So Safe Read is just kind of struggling against itself, trying to get itself to do what it needs to do. Obviously, Dudley Emperor is a way better card, and once we have that, Spike Brothers will be in a lot better of a spot. General Safe Read himself is just kind of struggling, and that's why this deck is so low on the tier list. Next up, we have Hellfire Ritual, the 12 critical version. So this is a deck that has a lot more Kagero in it than I was originally planning. At a certain point, sometimes just the trigger lineup is just that much better. So having access to 12 critical triggers is great. The downside is that we have fewer cards that we can just hand dump and move to Soul with Amon's effect. However, the 12 criticals themselves, it just compensates for that. So Amon Blazing Flare has always had this problem where it's very, very weak on defense, and then it wants to hand dump for a final turn push. If you cannot get your opponent high enough damage, then the deck just isn't going to work out well enough that you can end the game with a big push. And having those 12 crits either means that you can go in on 4 and have a fairly good chance, like a 30% chance, to hit a crit so that they have to block 2 of those huge attacks. Or you can hit them with criticals early if you get lucky enough, and then they're at 5, and then you can go in for the final turn push then. That's a more ideal strategy than doing the mostly Dark Irregulars version at this point, even though you have oftentimes get into a position where you cannot perfect guard. So I think taking perfect guards out of the deck may be necessary. And you also enter into a position sometimes where you just have too many Kagero cards, and then you have nothing to move to Soul, so then you can't proc your own effect to get bonus power. I've also had to deal sometimes with there just not being any rear guards to retire, but if that's the case, you're in a good position, so I'm not going to count that against this deck. Alright, so moving on next, these two decks are basically the same. We have Sakuya and Lena. Both of these cards are, when you ride them, return all of your rear guards back to your hand, and then they both get bonus power if you meet certain criteria. So Sakuya, if you have 4 or more cards, she's 4K, and this includes drive checks, obviously, like CEO. So if you have 2 cards in your hand and you perform an attack with her, she will be 14K once the second drive check goes into your hand and that's resolved properly. So that's solid. Very, very easy secondary effect. Lena is just if you have 4 or more other Bermuda Triangle rear guards. So the reason why these are actually a lot better than you might think is not just because Bermuda Triangle has synergy with bouncing, but just because of how rushing works and how field rescalability works. So what you can do with these decks is if you happen to get a fairly bad hand, let's say you get 3 triggers, you don't necessarily want those 3 triggers in your hand, but you can call them to the field and make 10k rows, which is perfectly sufficient to pressure your opponent on grade 1 and grade 2. And then once you ride your boss, whether it be Lena or Sakuya, they return to your hand, and then you can use them defensively after you've already used them offensively to rush and pressure your opponent. And generally speaking, the combination of them having a good attack power and them being able to rush without consequence later on, in addition to Lena having bonus synergy with Bermuda Triangle's bounce effects, all that together makes them fairly solid, a lot stronger than you might have otherwise thought. Anyway, that's going to round out tier 3, so let's go ahead and get tier 3.5 up. So starting off tier 3.5, I have Hellfire Ritual with rainbow triggers. This is the DI version of the deck. So the reason why it's so close to the other version, even though having the critical triggers is way better, is solely due to the fact that you being able to move cards to Soul consistently is very important. And because both of the decks each have a weakness that the other one lacks, and then they have a strength that the other one doesn't have, that's why they're so close. So in this case, Amon being able to move as much junk from your hand to Soul as possible to make those big final turns, even if you're missing a couple of the Kagero units, having that reliability is what makes this deck not so far behind the other one. Now, the downside is, of course, again, that getting your opponent to the 4 to 5 damage in order to try and end the game in the first place is extraordinarily difficult. Next up, we have Invincible Alfred. I'm not going to go over Mr. Invincible again. Alfred is Counterblast 3, which works on Rearguard Circle. Search your deck for a grade 2 or less Royal Paladin, call it to Rearguard, shuffle your deck. The advantage to King of Knights Alfred is that you can thin your deck of non-triggers, including calling his horse, and then you can Soul Blast with the soul that you gain from Mr. Invincible and have a 20k Alfred row. And all in all, that is incredibly synergistic. However, this is even less powerful of an effect than Invincible Overlord. In addition to that, even though you have Alfred thinning your deck of non-triggers, those non-triggers aren't going to have a substantive effect on your trigger ratios to the point where it's going to help you hit triggers too often. When you do have Alfred, you're looking at maybe using his effect 2, maybe 3 times a game. That's not really enough to make that big of a difference. That being said, well, the deck is still pretty fragile, even though you're going to be running 16 10k shields, which is nice. It's just not enough to get you as far as you need to. And then it has the same weakness that Invincible Overlord has, where you don't really want Alfred to be your Vanguard. And in addition to that, you have this problem where if you miss either, or if you get them in the wrong order, then your deck just doesn't work, and then it's super weak at that point. Of course, you know, most decks in this format have a fairly similar problem. It's just that when this deck misses its setup, it is just so much worse. It doesn't do anything when it misses its setup. And speaking of, Invincible Aleph is the same way. Aleph as a rear guard is Counterblast 4. It gets plus 3k and a crit, and then you run stand triggers so that you can hit multiple times potentially with that bonus crit. The weakness that Aleph has is, of course, the same as the other decks. It's fragile, and if you miss your setup, then it doesn't do anything. And you're not using your counterblast on anything else, so if you don't have Aleph, then your deck is just vanilla at that point. So there are things that you can utilize to try and make it a little bit stronger, but if you're stuck riding Aleph, you're kind of in trouble. and you're not really going to be able to accomplish a whole lot with the deck. Plus, you have to wait basically until limit break in order to use the effect anyway. So it's got a lot of weaknesses, but that being said, when the deck works, that is a crazy scary turn. Moving on, we have Beelzebub. Beelzebub somehow ended up being the strongest overall Dark Irregulars monoclan boss, and the reason for that is because he's able to make a lot bigger rearguard rows than the other Dark Irregulars Vanguards can do. The reason why Amon Blazing Flare is higher is because they can make even bigger rearguard rows than Beelzebub, because they're able to leverage the fact that you can retire your opponent's units and then get power with those Kagero units. Because that's not the case here, Beelzebub ends up winning out in the monoclan variant over regular Amon, but he is not better than the mixed variants. And the reason why he's actually able to be so strong is because we're forced in this format to run Vermilion Gatekeeper. So we are guaranteed to have 4 soul for him. And then all we need to do is just soul charge twice, which is trivial. A single Dark Soul Conductor, a single Hysteric Shirley, and then you're already there. It does have the downside of being forced to run 4 stand triggers, and stand triggers have anti-synergy with Beelzebub's effect, because if you give a unit power, and if it's not standing, then you have to hit the stand trigger in order for it to get the benefit of that bonus power. That being said, it's not really a big deal, because you can give bonus power to Beelzebub's booster, and then that would make Beelzebub hit that 21k number that you needed to hit. Or you can apply double power to the side row, and if you have, say, a grade 1 and a grade 2 Amon, then that's 26k, which is just ridiculous. And then the fact that, you know, if you hit a trigger, that can become 31k. Even if it's a stand trigger, it'll be 31k, and then potentially an 11k Amon grade 2 standing. And then you're just hitting them for all kinds of numbers all over the place that they're going to have a lot of trouble taking care of. So Beelzebub has a lot of overall potential in the synergistic way in which it goes and performs those attacks. And if it had 8 criticals, I think that this would actually be a lot stronger of a deck, because the fact that you're forced to run stands is actually tragic. If you had triggers that were always useful, then it would be in a lot better of a spot. But that being said, it has potential for being a little bit more defensive than other Dark Irregulars decks, because it can be 11k with minimal investment, and being able to leverage that attack power that the other decks can't use. As a matter of fact, most of the other bosses require you to counterblast 5 in order to do anything. This doesn't have that weakness, although it does have to eat up basically all of your counterblasts. So it's not like you can use your effects on something like Gwen the Ripper, but it is still overall a pretty viable, pretty strong boss. I don't think Beelzebub was actually ever all that weak. I managed to play him even in set 9, and I had some level of success with it. It's just not the greatest thing in the world. And by set 9, you have cards like Dark Lord of the Abyss that are going to want to take over the spotlight here. But I do feel a little bit sad that this card got overlooked, because it really wasn't all that bad. Anyway, next up we have Dark Metal Dragon. You might be surprised to see this card, but this card is honestly not terrible. Compared to what Phantom Blaster Dragon does, this card is actually better. The only difference is that it loses the name, which is why Phantom Blaster Dragon is a better card, just because of its name, not because of its effect. But Dark Metal Dragon swinging for 14k means that with a 7k boost, he gets 21k. That alone is viable. The problem that this has is that every single support card that Shadow Paladin has is utterly dependent upon you having the Blaster Ride Chain. And even this requires you basically to run the Blaster Ride Chain, because you don't have any other generic cards, any other generic starters. So what can you even do other than just ride the Ride Chain? And then once you're there, why are you not playing Phantom Blaster Dragon and having the 12k attacker? So that's the problem with Dark Metal Dragon. There are enough grade 2s that you could run that are viable, but the problem is they're all super counterblast heavy, and even if you tech in Cursed Lancer, it's really not doing a whole lot. And at the end of the day, like, you don't really need your Vanguard row specifically to be the only 21k row. It's much better to have a 21k rearguard row, because they have to overguard for your Vanguard for fear of triggers anyway. So that's why this deck is low. It's just because Shadow Paladin doesn't have enough to make this work. It's not even that this card is intrinsically bad. Shadow Paladin just doesn't have enough generic support yet. So next up, these are all basically going to be the same thing. Gold Rootle and Lion Heat are both Counterblast 2 when your Vanguard hits, stand another rearguard. That's not great. You have the ability to effectively make it cost nothing, But compared to Enigman Rain, which has Miracle Beauty, Nova Grapplers doesn't have a good target to stand. The best targets to stand in Nova Grapplers are Brutal Jack and Asura Kaiser, both of those being 11k. I guess Kung Fu Kid Bolta would also count, assuming that you meet the criteria to have it be 11k. Ultimately, Nova Grapplers are just struggling. They are struggling so hard to have good rear guards, and the fact that 11k is about where they hit max is very unfortunate. Obviously, Blaukluger has a 12k attacker, but they're the only ones, so you're kind of stuck. Gold Roodle's secondary effect is obviously better than Lion Heat's. What grade 1 are you going to want to stand? None of their grade 1s really get super big in order to have it be a front row unit so that when you stand it, you can attack with it. And if you're not using this to stand and attack with something, then it's useless. So Lion Heat's secondary effect is Poopy Caca. Gold Roodle's secondary effect is when your rear guard's attack hits a Vanguard, unflip 1. Nova Grapplers don't really need to unflip with their Vanguard because they have so much good unflip with their rear guards, and those unflipping units are reasonably statted. So Gold Roodle is also pretty superfluous, and that's why I kind of have these in the same general tier. I don't think either of them are particularly good, but standing a unit isn't necessarily that bad either in a deck with 12 crits, and it gives you more pressure to it forces them to guard your Vanguard, and I guess you can still run Death Metal Droid, but it's just super meh. And on that note, Asura Kaiser has the exact same problem. When you drive check a grade 3, stand one of your Nova Grapplers. Again, the problem is, actually this is when you drive check a grade 3 Nova Grappler, stand anything. So that's kind of cool that it can stand other things, but Asura Kaiser has a major problem, and that's that there aren't any other 11k grade 3s and Nova Grapplers. When we get set 6, we'll have Beast Deity Azure Dragon. When we get Galaxy Blaukluger, that'll be one. Mon Blaukluger, and what was it? Illuminal Dragon. So there are a bunch of 11Ks in the pipeline for Nova Grappler to get, but right now there just aren't enough, and that's the big reason why Asura Kaiser is so weak. And that's the reason why it's not doing super hot. There was Genocide Jack, which could counterblast to get bonus power, and paying for the counterblast for bonus power doesn't hurt as bad in a Nova Grappler deck because you have all the unflip. So Genocide Jack was actually a card that made this deck a lot stronger in this format, and they had access to it, but they didn't have the Genocide Jack trial deck along with the Crested Dragon, Star Drive Dragon, and Dynast decks. So because we're missing all of those cards, Asura Kaiser actually is way further down on the tier list than it otherwise might have been. Next up, we have the new Batama deck. So the first one is my Hagakure Grade 1 Rush deck. I think that that's probably about tier 3.5. While the deck does fight against itself to accomplish what it's trying to accomplish, what it does is it beats the crap out of your opponent super fast and super early. It has 16 critical triggers, even if it's a little bit inconsistent on them getting off. And then when your opponent is trying to attack you on the turn before you want to kill them, you drop all of your Hagakure, force them to discard a bunch of cards, and then you swing in next turn and try and kill them. That strategy is very, very strong. The problem is that if you have Hagakure in your hand, then it has the potential of keeping you from being able to rush on your board. And if you can't rush on your board because you have too many cards in hand, then you're not playing a grade 1 rush deck at that point. So if you ever fail to be able to field a completely full board at any point in time, the deck has failed. I haven't encountered that specific problem, but I do have the problem where it feels like if I have 3 Hagakure in my opening hand, which would otherwise be an automatic keep in any other scenario, I can't do that with this particular deck, and it just feels like it fizzles. So it feels like you want Hagakure, but you don't want Hagakure because you want to rush, but you also don't want to rush because you want Hagakure, and that's why the deck is as far down as it is. And rounding it out, we have just the new Batama Tech cards. So you can run Dreadmaster, Chigasumi, and Voidmaster. Obviously, you wouldn't be running Hagakure in that particular deck, but with Dreadmaster, Chigasumi, and Voidmaster, you would have the ability to force your opponent to discard cards whenever your attacks hit. This is excellent to use in any 12 or 16 critical deck, because if you have a Dreadmaster and Voidmaster row, and if that attack hits, you can Counterblast 2, force them to discard 2 cards, and they lose the rear guard, or they have to overguard for that, by protecting it with probably a 10k shield. Then you attack with your Vanguard, they're going to have to guard for that, and then critical pressure gets applied over to the other rear guard circle. That all works great in theory. The problem is if you ever have to ride Voidmaster, your deck is certainly going to fizzle, and it makes things very complicated from that point. Nothing lets you run 16 critical triggers by itself currently, although you could run 12 crit for heal. Overall, I don't feel like there's anything that's really able to utilize the Nubatama engine particularly well in this format. However, I do think that there is a card that does it very well in the next format, and that's Dungaree. So when we have Dungaree, I think that that's going to be the best mixer for Nubatama until we get a little bit further on. Either way, this deck, it has potential because obviously these cards are cracked. They're like set 13 power level and set 1. But right now, I don't know if there's anything that can utilize them consistently enough to be a particularly powerful deck. Anyway, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Have a good one.